The Great Hall of the Vanther Institute stretched across half a kilometer, its walls made of living crystal that hummed with ancient energy. 50 candidates from 32 different species stood in neat rows, their bodies casting strange shadows under the pale blue lights that floated overhead like captive stars. Commander HFY moved to the central platform, his crystalline body catching the light and scattering it into 1,000 rainbows across the assembled candidates. He was a Silurian, one of the oldest species in the Galactic Cooperative, and his voice rang out like wind chimes in a storm. "You have been selected from billions," he announced. His words translated instantly into every language through neural implants. "The Vanther Survival Examination is the most difficult test in the known galaxy. Only those who pass will earn the right to serve in the Ranger Corps, the elite protectors of the Cooperative." A murmur passed through the crowd. The Ranger Corps was legendary, a force that had kept peace across 10,000 worlds for over 1,000,000 years. To wear their insignia was the greatest honor any warrior could achieve. "The rules are simple," Commander HFY continued. "You will be dropped on Cryosix, an ice world in the outer rim. Temperatures reach -120 degrees Celsius at night. You will have 72 standard hours to survive with nothing but a basic multi-tool and the clothing you wear. No technology, no communication, no help. The last ones alive will join our ranks." In the third row, a stocky human woman named Elena Vasquez listened carefully to every word. She was the only human in the competition, a fact that had drawn considerable attention since her arrival 3 days ago. Humans were still newcomers to the galactic community, their species having achieved interstellar travel barely a century ago. Most aliens viewed them as curious primitives from a mild and gentle world. Elena had heard the whispers in the corridors. She had seen the pitying glances and the amused smiles. The other candidates looked at her small frame, her soft skin, her lack of natural armor or claws, and they saw an easy elimination. She did not mind their judgment. She had faced worse odds before. Born in the Siberian administrative zone of Earth, Elena had grown up in one of the coldest inhabited regions on her home planet. Her grandmother had taught her the old ways, the survival techniques that humans had developed over thousands of years of battling harsh winters. She knew how to read snow and ice like others read books. She understood cold the way a fish understands water. A tall reptilian creature pushed through the crowd and stopped beside her. His scales were thick and green, his eyes yellow with vertical slits. A long tail swished behind him as he looked down at the human with obvious contempt. "So you are the mammal everyone is talking about," he hissed, his forked tongue flicking out to taste the air. "I am Cyril of the Trexian Empire. My people have conquered 100 worlds." Elena looked up at him calmly. "I am Elena," she replied. "My people have conquered nothing but our own planet. But we are still here." Cyril laughed, a harsh sound like rocks grinding together. "Your species is soft and weak. You have no scales, no venom, no natural weapons. On Cryosix, you will freeze in the first hour. I almost feel sorry for you." "Save your sorrow for yourself," Elena said quietly. "You may need it." The Trexian snorted and walked away, his tail nearly knocking Elena off her feet. She steadied herself and returned her attention to the commander. "Your drop coordinates have been assigned randomly," HFY was saying. "Some of you will land in sheltered valleys. Others will find themselves on exposed ridges. This is the nature of survival, candidates. Luck plays its part, but skill determines who lives and who dies." A holographic display appeared in the center of the hall, showing the frozen surface of Cryosix. Mountains of ice rose toward a pale sky. Vast plains of snow stretched to every horizon. There was no plant life visible, no animals, nothing but endless white and deadly cold. "The storm season begins in 48 hours, the commander added. Those of you still alive at that point will face winds of 200 kilometers per hour and temperatures that will drop another 30 degrees. This is when most eliminations occur. Elena studied the display carefully, memorizing the terrain features and weather patterns. She noticed the angle of the ice formations, which told her the direction of the prevailing winds. She observed the density of the snow in different regions, which would determine what materials she had to work with. Around her, the other candidates were already forming their strategies. The Kakatari, an insectoid species with 6 limbs and hard exoskeletons, clustered together and clicked their mandibles in rapid communication. The Malorians, blue-skinned aquatic beings with antifreeze proteins in their blood, seemed almost bored by the challenge. The Drovathi, spider-like creatures from a cold world, stretched their 7 legs with confidence. None of them paid any attention to the small human in the 3rd row. "Prepare yourselves," Commander Etherall announced. "Drop begins in 1 standard hour. May fortune favor you all." The candidates began to disperse, heading to their assigned preparation chambers. Elena walked alone through the crystal corridors, her mind already working through the problems she would face. She knew what the others did not understand. She knew that humans were not survivors despite their weakness, but because of it. Her ancestors had walked out of Africa with nothing but sharp sticks and clever minds. They had crossed frozen land bridges, climbed impossible mountains, and spread to every corner of a planet that tried constantly to kill them. They had hunted mammoths in glaciers, built cities in deserts, and thrived in places that would destroy most species in days. The cold was an old enemy, and Elena knew how to fight old enemies. In her preparation chamber, she checked her multi-tool one final time. It was a simple device, capable of cutting, heating, and basic fabrication. Most candidates would use it for defense or hunting. Elena had other plans. She stretched her muscles, warming her body for the challenge ahead. She controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate, preparing her mind for the ordeal to come. She thought of her grandmother, who had survived 3 Siberian winters without power during the Great Collapse. She thought of her father, who had taught her to hunt in the frozen forests north of Yakutsk. She was ready. When the transport shuttle carried her toward the drop zone, Elena looked out at the frozen hell below and felt no fear. She saw not a death trap, but a puzzle. Not an enemy, but a challenge. The other candidates might have armor and venom and natural weapons, but she had something better. She had 10,000 years of human survival knowledge locked inside her brain. And that, she knew, would be enough. The drop pod hit the frozen ground with a thunderous crash, and Elena rolled out into a world of whitened silence. The cold struck her immediately, a sharp slap that stole the breath from her lungs. She stood quickly, taking stock of her surroundings with the trained eyes of a survivor. She had landed on an exposed ridge, just as Cyril had predicted. The wind howled across the open ground, carrying ice crystals that stung her face like tiny needles. There was no natural shelter in sight, no caves or overhangs to hide in. Just endless snow and ice under a pale sun that gave light but no warmth. It was the worst possible location. And Elena smiled. "Perfect," she whispered to herself. "Now we see what humans can do." She did not waste a single moment. While most candidates would have panicked at such an exposed position, Elena saw opportunity. The snow here was old and compressed, packed hard by countless winters. It was exactly the building material she needed. She pulled out her multi-tool and began to work. First, she walked the ridge carefully, testing the snow density with her boots and hands. She found a natural depression on the leeward side, sheltered slightly from the worst of the wind. This would be her construction site. Using the cutting function of her multi-tool, she began to carve blocks from the compressed snow. Each block was roughly 1/2 meter long, 1/4 meter wide, and a quarter meter thick. She worked steadily, her movements efficient and practiced, stacking the blocks beside her growing excavation. On a distant ridge, a Solarian candidate named Cothrol watched the human through a scope built into his crystalline eye. He had been assigned coordinates just 2 kilometers away and had found a small cave to shelter in. Now curiosity drew him to observe the strange mammal. What is she doing? He wondered aloud. Building a wall? That is pointless. The wind will destroy it. He watched for another hour as Elena continued her mysterious construction. The blocks were not forming a wall, he realized. They were curving, tilting inward, forming some kind of spiral structure. He could not understand the purpose. Meanwhile, across the frozen landscape, the other candidates were following their own survival strategies. The Trexians had found caves and crawled inside, trusting their thick scales to protect them from the cold. They were cold-blooded creatures, capable of slowing their metabolism to almost nothing. They planned to simply wait out the 72 hours in a state of near hibernation. The Kakitari were building elaborate crystalline structures using secretions from their bodies. These honeycombed shelters looked impressive, full of geometric precision and alien beauty. But they were made for their warm home world, designed to cool their inhabitants rather than warm them. The Malorians had found a frozen lake and burrowed beneath the ice. Their antifreeze blood allowed them to survive temperatures that would kill most species. They were confident that the cold could not touch them. The Drovathi were digging deep into the snow, creating burrows where their 7-limbed bodies could curl together. They came from a cold planet and knew the value of insulation. Of all the alien candidates, they were perhaps the best prepared. But none of them did what Elena was doing. As the pale sun began to sink toward the horizon, Elena completed the base layer of her structure. It was a perfect circle of snow blocks, each one leaning slightly inward. She began the second layer, offsetting the blocks like bricks, creating a dome that grew smaller with each ring. By the time darkness fell, she had finished. The igloo stood 2 meters tall at its center, a smooth dome of white that blended perfectly with the surrounding snow. The entrance was a narrow tunnel that dipped down before rising into the interior, a design that would trap cold air in the lower section and keep warm air inside the living space. Elena crawled inside and felt the difference immediately. The wind that had been cutting through her clothes was gone. The howling that had filled her ears faded to a distant murmur. Inside the igloo, the air was still and quiet. But she was not finished. She pulled out her multi-tool and began to smooth the interior walls, creating a glazed surface that would reflect heat back into the room. She carved a small shelf into the wall and placed on it a pile of dried lichen she had gathered during her construction. Plant life so tough it could survive even on this frozen world. She lit the lichen with a spark from her multi-tool, and a tiny flame flickered to life. It was barely larger than her thumb, but in the enclosed space of the igloo, it was enough. The temperature began to rise. Elena checked her surroundings one more time, then allowed herself to rest. She ate a small portion of emergency rations she had hidden in her clothing, knowing that calories were survival on a world like this. She performed gentle exercises to keep her blood flowing, then curled into a ball to conserve heat. Outside, the true cold arrived. The temperature plummeted as the sun vanished completely. -80 degrees became -100, then -120. The wind picked up speed, screaming across the ridges like a living thing. And the screaming was not just from the wind. The first elimination came at hour 16, announced by a sharp tone from the orbital monitoring station. A Trexian had died in his cave, his cold-blooded body unable to generate enough heat to keep his organs functioning. His metabolism had slowed too much, and he had simply stopped. At hour 18, 3 Kakitari shattered. Their beautiful crystalline shelters had done nothing to protect them from the cold, and their exoskeletons had become brittle as glass. The wind had finished what the cold began. At hour 20, 2 Malorians fell into hypothermic comas beneath their frozen lake. Their antifreeze blood had kept them alive, but their brains had begun to shut down from the extreme temperatures. Inside her igloo, Elena heard none of this. She slept peacefully, her body warm, her shelter holding strong against the howling darkness outside. The snow walls that the Silurian had mocked were proving to be the most effective insulation on the planet. Air trapped within the compressed snow blocked the transfer of heat, while the dome shape distributed the pressure of the wind evenly across the structure. She dreamed of her grandmother, standing in a snow-covered forest with a knowing smile. "The cold is not your enemy," the old woman said in the dream. "It is your teacher. Listen to what it tells you, and you will survive." Elena woke at dawn, refreshed and ready. She crawled out of her igloo and stretched in the pale morning light. The temperature was still far below zero, but the wind had died down, and the sun offered a tiny fraction of warmth. She looked across the frozen landscape and saw the smoke rising from distant monitoring drones, marking the locations where candidates had fallen during the night. There were many columns of smoke, more than she had expected. 18 down, she murmured. And this was only the first night. She turned back to her igloo and began to make improvements. The exam was only beginning, and she knew the worst was yet to come. But she also knew something that the other candidates had not yet learned. Survival was not about being the strongest or the fastest or the most adapted. It was about being the most prepared, the most determined, the most willing to fight for every single breath. And humans have been fighting for breath since the day they first walked upright on the African plains. The second day on Cryos X began with a blood-red sunrise that painted the ice fields in shades of crimson and gold. Elena stood outside her igloo, performing jumping exercises to warm her muscles and get her blood flowing. Steam rose from her body in the freezing air, proof that her internal fire was still burning strong. She had work to do. The first task was to improve her shelter. She extended the entrance tunnel, making it longer and adding a second bend. This would create an even more effective cold trap, preventing the frigid outside air from reaching her living space. She carved ventilation holes at precise angles near the top of the dome, small openings that would let fresh air in without letting heat escape. Next, she created a raised sleeping platform from packed snow. Cold air sinks, and by sleeping above the floor level, she would stay in the warmest part of the igloo. It was a simple principle, but one that could mean the difference between life and death. Finally, she set out to find food. The frozen carcass of some alien creature lay half buried in the snow about 300 meters from her shelter. It had probably been dead for centuries, preserved perfectly by the extreme cold. Elena approached it carefully, her multi-tool ready. She did not need the meat, which was frozen solid and would take too much energy to thaw and digest. What she needed was the fat. Using her cutting tool, she carved away chunks of frozen fat from beneath the creature's skin. Fat was the most valuable resource in a cold environment, packed with calories and capable of burning slowly for hours. She carried the chunks back to her igloo and began to render them, using the heat from her small fire to melt the fat into oil. She fashioned a simple lamp from a hollow she carved in the ice, filling it with the rendered fat and adding a wick made from fibers stripped from her clothing. When she lit it, the lamp produced a steady flame that gave both light and heat. It was not much, but in the endless darkness of the polar night, it would be enough. While Elena worked, the elimination count continued to rise. By midday, 23 candidates had fallen. The monitoring drones flew constantly across the frozen landscape, collecting the bodies of those who had succumbed to the cold. Some had frozen in their sleep, never knowing that death had taken them. Others had fought to the end, their final moments captured by the orbital cameras for the Academy records. Cyril the Trexian was still alive, but barely. He had found a shallow cave on a south-facing cliff, and the pale sunlight during the day had kept him warm enough to survive. But his scales were turning gray, and his movements had become slow and sluggish. He knew he could not last another night. Pride had kept him from seeking help. Pride had told him that a warrior of the Trexian Empire did not need assistance from lesser species. But pride was a poor substitute for warmth, and Cyril could feel his life slipping away with each passing hour. Finally, as the sun began to set and the deadly cold crept back across the ice fields, he made his decision. He crawled out of his cave and began the long journey toward the Human's Ridge. Elena saw him coming from a distance. A dark shape moving slowly across the white snow, stumbling and falling, rising and continuing. She watched without expression as the Trexian who had mocked her struggled through the deepening cold. Cyril collapsed at the base of her ridge, his strength finally giving out. He looked up at the human standing above him, her breath fogging in the frozen air, her eyes calm and unreadable. "Human," he rasped, his voice weak and broken. "I was wrong about you. I came to ask how you are doing this. How are you surviving when so many of us have fallen?" Elena studied him for a long moment. She could have left him there to die. He had insulted her, dismissed her, laughed at her species. By the rules of the examination, she owed him nothing. But that was not the human way. "Get up," she said finally. "I will show you." She helped him climb the ridge, supporting his weight with strength that surprised him. For such a small creature, the human was remarkably strong. Her muscles were dense and efficient, built for endurance rather than explosive power. She led him to her igloo and gestured at the structure. "Snow is not your enemy," she explained. "It is your greatest tool. Look at how it is built. The blocks are cut from compressed snow, which is full of tiny air pockets. Air is one of the best insulators in the universe. It traps heat and prevents it from escaping." Cyril stared at the dome with new eyes. "But it is just frozen water. How can it protect against the cold?" "Because the cold outside cannot reach the warmth inside," Elena replied. "The walls are thick enough to block the transfer of heat. The entrance tunnel dips down before rising, which traps the coldest air in the lowest section. Inside, my body heat and a small flame are enough to raise the temperature above freezing." She showed him the interior, where the fat lamp burned steadily and the air was almost comfortable. "You see? The same snow that is killing your friends is keeping me alive. The difference is knowledge." Cyril was silent for a long time, processing what he had learned. "My people conquered 100 worlds," he said finally. "We have the most advanced weapons in the cooperative. But we never learned to do this. We never needed to. That is the difference between our species," Elena said. "Your people evolved to dominate their environment. Mine evolved to adapt to it. We are not the strongest or the fastest or the most dangerous, but we are the most flexible. We learned to survive anywhere because we had no choice." She did not invite him into her shelter. The examination was still ongoing, and each candidate had to survive on their own. But she did show him the basic principles of construction, demonstrating how to cut blocks and stack them in a spiral pattern. "You may not have time to build a full igloo before nightfall," she warned. "But even a partial windbreak could save your life. The key is to reduce heat loss. Block the wind, insulate your body, stay dry. These are the fundamentals of cold weather survival." Cyril bowed his head, a gesture of deep respect among his people. "I misjudged your species, human. I thought you were prey, but I see now that you are something far more dangerous. You are survivors." Elena smiled slightly. "We've been called many things over the centuries. Weak, soft, fragile, primitive. But we are still here. We outlasted ice ages, supervolcanoes, and plagues. We survived everything our planet could throw at us. And we will survive this too. The Trexian began his slow journey back to his cave, carrying with him the knowledge that might save his life. Elena watched him go, then returned to her igloo to prepare for the coming night. The storm was coming. She could feel it in the air, see it in the way the clouds were gathering on the horizon. Tomorrow would bring the true test, the challenge that would separate the survivors from the fallen. She checked her supplies, reinforced her walls, and settled into wait. Whatever the storm brought, she would be ready. She was human, after all, and humans had been weathering storms since the dawn of their existence. The storm arrived at hour 48, like the wrath of an angry god. Elena woke to the sound of wind screaming across the ice fields, a howling fury that made the previous night seem calm by comparison. Her igloo shuddered under the assault, the walls groaning as pressure built against the curved surface. Snow and ice particles struck the structure with the force of bullets, a constant drumming that filled the interior with noise. She checked their ventilation holes and found them blocked. The driving snow had sealed them completely, cutting off her air supply. Already, she could feel the oxygen growing thin, her breaths becoming shorter and less satisfying. This was bad. Without fresh air, she would suffocate long before the cold could kill her. Moving quickly, she used her multi-tool to carve new holes, angling them downward so the wind would not fill them immediately. It was delicate work, and she had to be careful not to weaken the structural integrity of her dome. One mistake could bring the whole shelter crashing down on top of her. The temperature outside had plummeted to negative 150 degrees. Even through the thick snow walls, Elena could feel the cold trying to reach her, searching for any weakness, any gap in her defenses. She added more snow to the interior walls, building up the insulation, fighting back against the deadly chill. Her fat lamp flickered and nearly died as oxygen became scarce. She carefully adjusted the ventilation, creating a delicate balance between fresh air and heat retention. Too much airflow and the cold would rush in. Too little, and she would slowly poison herself with her own breath. Outside, the storm was claiming lives. The monitoring systems recorded elimination after elimination as candidates succumbed to the worst weather in Cryosix history. The Malorians, who had seemed so comfortable beneath their frozen lake, finally reached the limit of their antifreeze blood. Their bodies began to crystallize from the inside out, ice forming in their cells and destroying them from within. The Keikitari, those who had survived the first nights, shattered like glass ornaments in the wind. Their exoskeletons had become so brittle that the pressure waves alone were enough to crack them. The beautiful crystalline structures they had built became their tombs, collapsing around them in the gale. Even the Dravathi, the cold-adapted species that had seemed so confident, began to fall. Their burrows filled with snow blown by the wind, suffocating them in their sleep. Their seven-limbed bodies were found frozen in desperate poses, trying to dig their way out of their own shelters. The Silurian candidate, Cothrol, who had watched Elena build her igloo with such contempt, discovered the fatal flaw in his crystalline body. Extreme cold made crystal brittle, and the temperature variations caused by the storm created stress fractures throughout his form. He cracked at hour 52, his body splitting into 1,000 shards that scattered across the frozen plain. By hour 54, only 12 candidates remained. By hour 58, the number had dropped to 7. Elena fought her own battle inside her igloo. The entrance tunnel had collapsed under the weight of drifting snow, sealing her inside. She was now completely cut off from the outside world, trapped in a tiny dome of snow with limited air and failing light. For the first time since the examination began, fear touched her heart. But fear was an old companion for humans. Fear had walked beside her ancestors on the frozen plains of the Ice Age. Fear had whispered in their ears as they faced Sabretooth, cats and giant bears and all the terrible predators of the ancient world. They have learned to use fear, to channel it, to transform it from a weakness into a weapon. Elena controlled her breathing, slowing her heart rate with techniques passed down through generations. Her grandmother had taught her this, the old woman who has survived 3 winters without power. Fear makes you use more oxygen, the grandmother had said. Calm your body, calm your mind, and you will need less air to survive. She sat in the darkness, conserving every resource, waiting for the storm to pass. She performed small isometric exercises, tensing and relaxing her muscles to generate heat without consuming too much oxygen. She sang old songs under her breath, Russian folk tunes that her father had taught her, keeping her lungs active and her spirits high. Hours passed. The wind continued to scream. The cold continued to press against her walls. At hour 60, Elena knew she had to act. The air was becoming too thin, her thoughts beginning to blur at the edges. If she waited any longer, she would fall asleep and never wake up. She began to dig. Working by feel in the total darkness, she carved a new tunnel through the collapsed entrance. The snow was densely packed, compacted by the wind into something almost as hard as ice. A multi-tool cut through it slowly, painfully, centimeter by centimeter. Her arms burned with exhaustion. Her lungs screamed for air. Spots danced before her eyes, the first signs of oxygen deprivation. But she kept digging, kept pushing, kept fighting. This was what it meant to be human. This was the legacy of 10,000 years of survival against impossible odds. Every ancestor who had lived through famine, plague, war, and disaster had passed on their strength to their descendants. Elena carried the determination of 100 generations in her bones. Finally, after what seemed like hours, but was probably only minutes, she broke through. Fresh air rushed into the tunnel, cold and sharp and wonderful. She gasped it in, feeling life return to her starving lungs. She did not crawl outside. The storm was still raging. An exposure would kill her in seconds. But she had created a lifeline, a connection to the outside world that would keep her breathing until the weather passed. She collapsed in her shelter, exhausted beyond measure, but alive. The storm howled its fury at her, angry that she had escaped its grasp. But Elena just smiled in the darkness and whispered a single word: survived. By hour 64, the storm began to weaken. The wind dropped from 200 kilometers per hour to 100, then to 50. The temperature remained deadly, but the worst of the assault had passed. When Elena finally checked the elimination count, she discovered that only 4 candidates remained. Herself, a Malorian who had found a thermal vent by pure luck, a Drovathy who had dug the deepest burrow on the planet, and Cyril the Trexian. Cyril had survived. Elena looked in the direction of his cave and felt something like pride. The arrogant reptile who had laughed at her had learned from a human. He had built a crude snow shelter using the techniques she had taught him, and that shelter had saved his life. 4 survivors from 50 candidates. It was the lowest success rate in the history of the Vanther examination. And one of those survivors was human. The storm broke at hour 68, and pale sunlight crept across a transformed landscape. Mountains of snow had been sculpted into alien shapes by the wind, creating a frozen maze of ridges and valleys that looked nothing like the terrain from 3 days before. The ice fields gleamed under the weak sun, beautiful and deadly. Elena crawled out of her igloo and stood on shaking legs. Her body was exhausted, pushed to limits that few humans had ever experienced. Frost coated her eyelashes, and her lips were cracked and bleeding from the dry cold. But her core temperature was stable, her mind was clear, and her heart was still beating. She had survived. Around her, the silence was complete. The screaming wind had died, replaced by an absolute stillness that was almost eerie. The only sounds were her own breathing and the crunch of snow under her boots as she walked to the edge of her ridge. She could see the smoke rising from distant monitoring drones, marking the locations of the fallen. There were so many columns of smoke scattered across the ice fields like grave markers. 46 candidates had died over the past 72 hours, their bodies being collected even now for transport back to their home worlds. A movement caught her eye, and she turned to see Cyril climbing the ridge toward her. The Trexian looked terrible, his scales gray and cracked, his movements slow and painful. But he was alive, and that was what mattered. "Human," he called out, his voice weak but filled with something that might have been respect. "You did it! You survived the frozen hell." Elena nodded slowly. "We both did." "Your shelter held?" "Barely," Cyril admitted. "It collapsed twice during the storm. I had to rebuild it each time. But your principles saved my life. Without your teaching, I would have died in the first hour of the storm." They stood together on the ridge, watching the sun rise higher into the pale sky. From the south, two other figures were approaching, moving slowly across the snow. The Malorian who had found the thermal vent was being supported by the Drovathi, both of them barely conscious but still breathing. 4 survivors. In the entire history of the Vanther examination, no test had ever claimed so many lives. The sound of engines broke the silence, and a shuttle descended from the clouds. It landed on a flat stretch of ice below the ridge, its doors opening to reveal Commander Ethavral and a team of medical personnel. The crystalline Solorian stepped out onto the frozen ground, his faceted eyes scanning the 4 survivors with an unreadable expression. "Candidates," he announced, his voice carrying across the ice fields. "You have completed the Vanther survival examination. You are the survivors of Cryos Ix." The 4 remaining candidates gathered before him, a pitiful remnant of the 50 who had begun the test. The Malorian could barely stand, his blue skin turned almost white from hypothermia. The Drovathi was missing 2 of his 7 limbs, lost to frostbite during the worst of the storm. Cyril was a shadow of the proud warrior who had mocked Elena 3 days ago. Only Elena stood relatively steady, her body battered but unbroken. The Drovathi stared at her with something approaching awe. "How?" he asked, his voice a whisper. "Your species has no natural armor, no antifreeze blood, no thermal regulation organs. You are soft and fragile. You should have been the first to fall, not the last one standing." Elena looked at him, then at the other survivors, then at the endless white expanse that had claimed so many lives. When she spoke, her voice was quiet but steady. "That is what everyone thinks when they first meet humans," she said. "They see our soft skin and assume we are weak. They see our lack of claws and fangs and assume we are harmless. They see our short lives and assume we are insignificant." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "But humans are not survivors despite our weakness. We are survivors because of it. Our bodies are not adapted to any specific environment, so we learn to adapt to all of them. We cannot outrun predators, so we learn to outlast them. We cannot survive the cold with our biology, so we learn to survive it with our minds." She gestured at her igloo, still standing proud on the ridge. "My ancestors walked out of Africa with nothing but stones and fire. They crossed frozen continents, climbed impossible mountains, sailed across endless oceans. They faced ice ages that lasted thousands of years, and they survived. They faced famines and plagues and disasters that killed millions, and they kept going. They were not strong like the Trexians, or cold-adapted like the Drovathi, or filled with antifreeze like the Malorians. But they were stubborn and clever, and determined never to give up." Commander Ethavral stepped forward, his crystalline body catching the sunlight. "I have overseen 37 Vanther examinations," he said slowly. "I have seen the greatest warriors of the Cooperative tested on the most hostile worlds in the galaxy. Never have I seen anyone survive with such efficiency. Your shelter design, your resource management, your adaptation to crisis. It was remarkable. Elena shook her head. It was not remarkable. It was human. Every technique I used has been known to my people for thousands of years. We have been building snow shelters since before we had written language. We have been surviving in frozen wastelands since before we left our home planet. This is what we do. This is who we are. Cyril stepped forward and performed the Trexian bow of deep respect, lowering his head until his chin touched his chest. I laughed at you before the test, he said. I called your people soft and weak. I thought you would be the easiest elimination. I was wrong. I was a fool. You are the most dangerous species I have ever encountered. Dangerous? Elena raised an eyebrow. I have no venom, no claws, no scales. You have something far worse, Cyril replied. You have the ability to turn any environment into a weapon against your enemies and a tool for your survival. You do not need to be strong because you make the world work for you. That is a power beyond anything biological evolution can provide. The commander gestured toward the shuttle. Come. You have earned your place in the Ranger Corps. Your names will be recorded in the Hall of Survivors, and your deeds will be studied by future generations. As they walked toward the shuttle, the Drovathy fell into step beside Elena. Will you teach us? He asked. Will you share the human ways of survival with the cooperative? Elena smiled. Of course. Knowledge is meant to be shared. That is another thing humans learned long ago. When one of us discovers something useful, we teach it to others. That is how we grew from scattered tribes to a species that spans the stars. The shuttle rose from the frozen surface of Cryos X, carrying the 4 survivors toward the orbital station. Elena looked down at the ice world that had tested her so thoroughly, and she felt a strange affection for it. It had tried to kill her, but in doing so, it had reminded her of what humans truly were. Not the strongest, not the fastest, not the most adapted, but the most determined, the most creative, the most unwilling to accept defeat. In the weeks that followed, word spread across the Galactic Cooperative. Stories were told in cantinas and council chambers, in military academies and diplomatic halls. The tale of the human who had built a shelter from snow while aliens froze around her became legend. And everywhere the story went, it carried the same warning. Be careful with the humans. They come from a death world where everything tries to kill them. They have survived ice ages, supervolcanoes, plagues, and wars. They do not know how to give up. They do not know how to die. Elena Vasquez became the first human to graduate from the Vanter Institute. Her igloo design was added to the official curriculum, taught to candidates from 100 different worlds. But her greatest legacy was not a building technique or a survival method. It was a simple truth that the galaxy had finally learned. Humans are not weak. They never were. They are simply survivors, waiting for their moment to prove what they can do. And when that moment comes, they will always find a way to win. Always.